Chocholonahote, Talsadan Dedene de Otsi, Chiskia Ezdetzei, Candis Ushia. So in the language of my ancestors, I am from the Crow clan of the Tahltan Nation. And it is an honor and a privilege to be on Musqueam land. I live and work with permission from Musqueam. I actually live on the Musqueam Reserve, and I wake up every morning to the sound of birds. I go to sleep often at this time of the year to the sound of coyotes celebrating dinner. And I get to walk the trails around Musqueam and visit with the river and be renewed constantly by land that has been cared for by Musqueam people since time immemorial. And for those of us from First Nations in BC and the Yukon, that term, time immemorial, is something I feel like we learn from the cradle. It's because our leaders have been fighting for treaties for over 100 years. They have been asking for a relationship with the Canadian government, with the BC government, and part of that is to continually explain that we have been here since time immemorial. This image that you're looking at of Mount Edzaidza, which is at the center of our territory. It's a massive volcanic region. I had the opportunity to take my daughter in for a hike with Tenema Hodihi, which is part of T-Wild, which Nadia mentioned. And I got to fly over our territory for the first time in this area. And it was honestly one of the most spectacular experiences of my life. And I got to go into an obsidian quarry, which is right near where this image is taken. And it's where we dropped off our young people to go on an incredible journey through our territory, a really difficult one that I'm not sure I personally could do at this age, but we leave it to the young people to do that. And there was an archaeologist who was with us, who was training students to really look at the rocks and geology quite differently than they might otherwise. And I asked him about time immemorial, like, what does this really mean? And he said, well, you get to 10,000 years and it's not like we lose count, but we stop caring because you've been there so long, you've been there forever. And to me, that was just like a really important moment to kind of recognize how deeply embedded we are with the land. When it comes to time immemorial, it is truly beyond time, beyond when it's important to keep track. And so you have received a master class. I mean, I wish Larry Grant would introduce every talk I give, because you have received a master class in both that long relationship and the long tail of colonialism for the last, in this area, really it's only 150 years that we're talking about. In other parts of this continent, it's much longer. But this is, this is a really important gathering, I think, in the way that he mentioned, because this word ethical is a powerful one. I taught media ethics here at UBC for about a decade, and I used to always open the class with a joke, which is that I was actually at my sister's house, who also lives on Musqueam, and one of her friends, who's a former chief, asked me, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I'm, just started teaching at UBC, and she says, "Well, what are you teaching?" And I said, "Media ethics." She said, "Oh, you mean they have those?" Nice little class joke. But I think this is a real challenge, right? In terms of thinking about what's ethical when there has been, as Larry described, so much unethical behavior. How do we find our feet? How do we begin to think anew about what it means to be in an ethical relationship? And as I tell my students, we're always sure of what's good and what's bad. It's all the stuff in between. So hopefully in this talk, I'm going to give you sort of some of my diagnostics to think with I started giving land acknowledgements before it was popular to do so. And I did it at a lot of US talks where people would be like, what are you talking about? Because colonialism in the US is even, a sort of in an earlier stage of conversation than it is here in Canada, thanks in part to Idle No More, thanks in part to the TRC, thanks in part to all the work that our leaders have done for decades and decades to educate the Canadian public. And so, I started giving these land acknowledgements because it's protocol to do so. In BC, we're very aware of whose land we're on. If you're from a BC First Nation, you're very aware of it because we have so many nations here. We have so many different language groups. We have so many different dialects, as Larry explained, within language groups. So we're always very aware. And it's important to recognize the long caretaking. But I also started acknowledging whose land I was on when I was giving a talk about climate change, because I wanted to acknowledge the ongoing challenges, deep history, and legacies of colonialism like displacement, forced migrations, broken or non-existent treaties, and intergenerational trauma that gets shifted off to the side, swallowed up, or subsumed by crises like climate change. So even while as many Indigenous leaders, communities, and scholars have pointed out, climate change amplifies the vulnerabilities that colonialism and its legacies have produced. So in that vein, I want to talk today about 4 things. I want to talk about this notion of emergency or crisis. UBC has adopted this term emergency, so we're all in an academic environment. Let's open up the term emergency and start talking about what it is. I want to talk about Indigenous knowing, and I say it that way because it's not static. And I want to talk about narratives, both about climate change and Indigenous people. And lastly, I want to talk about how we might begin to ask questions about what constitutes ethical relations. So first, let me situate you in the present. So this is a tweet that went out last week. If you have been living under a hole, which I'm assuming you haven't been because you're here and you're talking about climate change, you know that there was a report released by the World Meteorological Association last week that said it looks like we are going to break the 1.5 degree climate threshold. And why is that important? Well, because back in 2018, we were given an earlier warning, which is that you have 12 years, right? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said you have about 12 years in order to limit what could likely be multiple catastrophes around the globe in different ways, in that way that climate change is, a pattern and not necessarily signals, right? And that report that came out in 2018 from the IPCC, it said, this is a line in the sand. We need to change global infrastructure. We need to make the kinds of changes that we haven't made yet, and we have a window, right? I wrote a piece for a history of science journal called The 12-Year Window, right? In order to really think through what 12 years even means like in the history of this issue, but in the history generally of how we think about environment. And, media covered it here in Canada. The first tweet showed you that it wasn't covered so well in the UK, where there's been actually a massive commitment to cover climate change in a way there hasn't been in other countries. So you can tell that there is some fatigue currently in how to cover this. But, the CBC trotted out a lovely story about what it means for Canada. And I don't know if you read this story, but it's pretty incredible if you're thinking with the North, as I do, and as I know Nadia does, and probably many of you who are from Northern communities or grew up in Northern communities, think with the Northwest Territories has already said they're at 2 to 4 degrees above. So they're past 1.5 degrees. We're already looking at changes in the BC environment because look at the heat we're experiencing, look at the fires we're experiencing, right? It's not it's not as if we're not surrounded by signs and symptoms all the time. And I was saying to my family the other day, I said, I've been studying climate change for over 20 years, and I'm not sure that I could have predicted the intensity with which we are experiencing signs and symptoms right now. Not here. I didn't expect it to be like this, despite all the reports and talks that I have sat through. And I think, generally, if you look at the way that climate change has been covered, this is a group out of the University of Colorado who keeps track of print newspapers' coverage of climate change. And you can see that Canada has followed a pattern, save for the National Post, and you can guess what kind of coverage that was. You want to dig into that data, you might guess. But it has generally followed what world coverage has followed, right? There was a lot of attention round about, 2010 when reports were coming out from 2008 and 2009. You can see lots of ups and downs of coverage. But essentially, what new research has told us about media coverage of climate change is that most people are aware of it. They're aware of what a problem it is, but they can't tell you very much about what's being done. They can't tell you very much about their government's policy. So there is a really big gap in terms of how we think about this problem and how we take action on it. And, this is where I think activism is worth thinking with, and where we need to also begin to think very clearly about what it is we're doing when we consider something a crisis. When I initially started working on climate change, this was a very true statement back in the early 2000s that climate change as a narrative is built exclusively on the language of scientific expertise and physical causation, right? It was very much a scientific problem when it emerged onto the scene sort of in the late 1980s, when you sort of have James Hansen giving his, first testimony before US audiences and US lawmakers. So is it still true? In an article I wrote in 2021, I asked that question, right? Is this still a problem? And I think what has happened is that we have begun to think of climate change as a crisis, as an emergency, as something that should be causing us panic, and rightly so. When you look at the kind of predictive frameworks that we have, when you look at those predictions. However, we haven't also thought about the ethics of the actions that are being taken in response to the crisis. We haven't even thought necessarily about the ethics of how we talk about climate change. And crisis talk, what anthropologists have been saying, with very good rationales based on many other times in which the words crisis and emergency have been used, is that crisis talk really limits questions about how we got here and what happened to focus on what must be done, right, in order to avert what's happening. And as you heard from Larry, you can't evade how we got here in order to get to a question of what do we do. And, in Indigenous communities like my own, in Arctic communities where I've conducted research, climate change is not the first epic ecological disaster, right? Nor is it understood as somehow separate from all of the other issues that are facing communities, that are facing nations. Rather, climate change layers onto oral histories and traditional stories that discuss ecological change in the distant past, right? These stories and the present are deeply connected to more recent histories of settler colonial dispossession, right? Of the disruption between relations between humans and non-humans and more than humans. So emergency, right? If you look up the definition of it, it's a serious and unexpected, often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. But can we honestly say that climate change is unexpected? Are we really looking at something that we couldn't have foreseen? And I think this is where thinking with Indigenous knowledge, even if you're not an Indigenous person, becomes very important and really important if you're trying to figure out what ethical relations look like. I like to use Indigenous scholars' definition of Indigenous knowledge because I find that they're thinking with their own ancestors as much as they are thinking with concepts that come out of, an academic structured conversation. And so Robin Kimmerer describes Indigenous knowledge as rational and reliable knowledge that has been developed through generations of intimate contact by Native people with their lands. Deborah McGregor talks about traditional knowledge as not just knowledge about the relationships with creations, it's a relationship, right? It's the way that one relates. And it's partly why I've moved to, in a lot of my titling, talking about Indigenous knowing, because that relationship hasn't stopped, it continues. And that relationship is rooted in deep, deep understanding that comes from our ancestors. And yet, right, academia came along with this term called the Anthropocene, right? And Simon Lewis and Mark Maislin, who've done some incredible work. They are the same authors who released a study with two other co-authors about, the millions of people that were killed as a result of colonialism. And as my co-podcast scholar Kim Tallbear often points out when we've talked about these sorts of issues, it wasn't just a genocide that happened to Indigenous people, it also happened to our non-human relatives, right? And that is actually, the sets of data that these scientists have looked at is really looking at all of our non-human relatives, our plant relatives, our, animal relatives, all of these relations that we have, they also suffer, and they are the ones who carry the records forward about what happened. And so, the form, and this is what they point out, the formal definition of the Anthropocene makes scientists arbiters, right, to an extent of the human-environment relationship. Consider that in relation to what Indigenous scholars have said about how traditional knowledge is about the relationship, right? The ongoing relations. The historians also have jumped in trying to historicize how the Anthropocene is both useful and a demarcation of change, right? Of a change in the way that we think about our relations. And Deepesh Chakrabarty has pointed out, right, that this moment of climate change is not because we haven't known catastrophes. We have, but the knowledge did not affect our quotidian sense of an innate assurance that the earth provides a stable ground on which we project our political purposes. Right, so the Anthropocene disturbs that certainty by bringing the geological into the everyday. For Indigenous people, as you heard from Larry, that's why I'm saying I wish he just introduced every talk. I probably wouldn't have to say much, but here I am talking. You hear the way in which the geological is in the everyday, right? That's not new. That's not a new practice for Indigenous people. I happened to be at a conference with a lot of scientists. It was a big gathering. There are people from all different academic disciplines who were presenting their sort of research on climate change, sort of their take, where they were coming from, different kinds of data. I've been in a lot of these meetings, but this was in about 2018, 2019, right at the time when there was a lot of debates about the Anthropocene. And people like Zoe Todd and Heather Davis were really challenging, the Anthropocene as a concept, when in fact, for most Indigenous people, it's a continuation that began with colonialism. So if you want to set a marker for change, set it at 1492. Don't set it, in the most recent past. And it really hit me while I was sitting in this conference that the very concept that we are talking about, change, is culturally loaded, right? I think a lot with Robin Wall Kimmerer, but I also think with a lot of other scholars, Kyle White and Deborah McGregor and Kim Tallbear. And I also think with a lot of the people from my First Nation, from BC First Nations, who I've heard speak over the years. And I think that we have to, really begin to think about change and stability. If all of the discussions about the Anthropocene are about recognizing change, then we have to think about stability and where that comes from and what our thinking is about it. Because what colonial time does, as Kyle White would say, it sort of thinks about the past as something that is incredibly stable. And then we make changes. But, just a second. I'd argue that the stability of the earth depends not on stability as a thing in and of itself, but rather on relations and responsibilities between humans and non-humans. Thus, it follows our assurance of stability should stem from continual assessment of the state of these relations, right? Such an approach rests on the assumption that the geological is present and in the everyday through Indigenous knowledge, lifeways, and stories. Stability is not the foundation, but rather a result of being in good relations, something that must be maintained and worked towards. So Kimmerer, who is a citizen Potawatomi biologist, begins this book with the story of Sky Woman in order to orient the reader to this other way of reciprocal thinking and to Indigenous knowledges, languages, and epistemologies. This is the weighty distinction in considering lands, waters, animals, and others as non-human relatives, for whom and with whom there are reciprocal obligations. In such a framework, crisis is located not in the presentation of symptomatic evidence only, but rather considered alongside diagnoses arrived at through analyses of relations, responsibilities, and reciprocity. Stability is something not just to track and evidence as in peril, where disasters mount and add to the panic. Rather, stability becomes a shared goal that requires constant maintenance. Right? So this is a very different way of thinking about this moment we're in, a way of thinking about our relationship with the lands, the waters, the non-humans, and with each other, about where we sit in the context that we're in. This image here that you're looking at comes from my first book, How Climate Change Comes to Matter, where I went out onto the tundra with an Inuk elder. And he showed me that this is one of the very subtle signs that the tundra is changing. It's drying out and cotton grass is moving in where lichen used to be, which has a pretty big impact on the caribou, right? Which has a huge impact on the humans who rely on the caribou, right? So these very subtle changes that we are witnessing and have been witnessing for 20, 30, 40, 50 years across the North, in my community is very similar. The caribou patterns are changing. We're trying to understand it in various ways. Our salmon patterns are changing, right? These are indications that our relations and the context for our relations, the conditions that make our relations possible are changing. And yet, in many talks that I have given, I still get accosted by scientists who tell me that Indigenous knowledge is not that useful, that Indigenous people didn't know that much when literally these things happened to me. And still, right, the studies come from other corners of science. I really admire this study that came out in 2019, right, from people who study biodiversity. And it is really hard proof that Indigenous management of land looks really different. If you take it a global picture of what's happening, right? Approximately 35% of all remaining, approximately 35% of the area that is formally protected and approximately 35% of all remaining terrestrial areas with very low human intervention. Those are lands under Indigenous control. They are declining, surely, because of the broader context, but not at the same rate. Many of the challenges that stem from colonial narratives persist, however, right? So while we have these incredible studies that inform us with hard data, what the global picture looks like, we still have these kinds of things that emerge. This was discovered by one of my research assistants who was a student in the journalism school at the time. We were analyzing all of the Twitter feed related to COP21, right? The big Paris Agreement COP, Conference of the Parties, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And he was just completely shocked that this kind of thing still went on. And I was like, see all those talks I've given you about Indigenous people being invisible, the hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who live across the Arctic and have lived there since time immemorial. This is also the reality when it comes to reporting on big events like COP21. You can see that national media in Canada, only the CBC was quoting or mentioning Arctic communities. You really had to turn to regional media to hear from Indigenous people about what was happening to the lands that they have been managing. And, Inuit leaders like Oglaluk Igiziak, who at that time was the international chair for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, have been speaking into these voids. That's what they are. When you say population zero, that's a void, right? Been speaking into these voids very powerfully, right? Talking about how polar bears aren't the spokespeople for the Arctic or for climate change, right? It's the fact-based traditional knowledge holders. When COP21 was announced, she took to Twitter and challenged so many reporters who were full of only praise for the Paris Agreement. And try as I might, I looked and paid attention very closely. I could only find one story of a reporter who interviewed her. It's a CBC-based blog that looks specifically at Arctic stories, and they went and interviewed Oglaluk Igisiak, and she said very clearly, right, there's some, that Paris Agreement we could look at as a kind of success because it mentioned traditional knowledge, it mentioned Indigenous people, but as she says so clearly, right, there isn't much commitment to work with us. And I think this is what you're hearing in many corners of the world, right? It isn't just Indigenous people in Canada who have been saying these kinds of things into global media voids. It's Indigenous people from all over the world have been saying, work with us. When I finished my 2014 book, I looked at 5 different groups. I looked at evangelicals in the US. I looked at Inuit leaders who were part of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. I looked at corporate social responsibility activists who were taking climate change to Wall Street and making it climate risk. I looked at scientists who were speaking very strongly into public forum fora and different kinds of venues and arenas. And I looked at science journalists who were also struggling in it. And at that time, the challenge was that there wasn't enough attention paid to climate change, and Indigenous people were bringing in these other sorts of considerations, right? The sort of human face, as Sheila Watt Cloutier would say, the human face of climate change. And when I ended that book, I wrote this epilogue, which was all about collaboration, all about the very things that you're talking about here today. Because to me, this is the hardest problem: how we figure out how to work together, how to move past all the narratives, how to both acknowledge the long tail of colonial histories. And part of it involves recognizing the rootedness of those narratives. This is a slide I made for a talk that I gave to scientists right before I went on medical leave, just to make it really, really clear that how Indigenous people have been thought of is either as victims or heroes, or as proxies, right? The canary in the coal mine. As a Inuit leader, I read said, like, how can canaries die? Why are you comparing us to canaries, right? This is a really problematic also, problem. And when it comes to representing Indigenous people as holders of supplemental knowledge, so something that might help fill out the scientific record, instead, right, begin to think of Indigenous people as agents, as experts on their own territories, on their own waters, as experts that, scientific experts can also be in conversation with, right, as kin with land, and as navigating colonial institutions. As you heard Larry talk about his relationship with UBC, UBC is a colonial institution. So how Indigenous people navigate here, how the community on whose land this is on navigates, that is, a form of ongoing relations that we have to be mindful of in order to consider, the multiple scales that you're dealing with when it comes to something like climate change. And, I think Kyle White's work is really useful here too, is that this notion of collective continuance is not something that I hear a lot of in climate change conversations that I'm part of. Often, it's about policy with a big P. It's about science with a big S. And yet that quote you started with was with a Gwich'in leader, right? That communities are the solution. This is, to me, what this notion of collective continuance is really about. It is about recognizing that communities have to adjust to current and predicted change in ways that contest colonial hardships and embolden comprehensive aims at robust living. And societal institutions like UBC can either create more constraints, make it more difficult, or they can open up opportunities. And so again, this is a set of diagnostic questions that I have presented to a couple of different audiences, and it comes out of a recent book I did with my colleague at UBC, Mary Lynn Young, where we asked these sorts of questions of media, in particular journalism, in whose interest, like who are you serving, right? And as Larry pointed out, Indigenous people often end up being the problem. Indians are the problem, right? So who's defining the problem and for whom is it a problem, right? And then you can dial back into what the history is that you're dealing with, what the relations have been, and what your obligations are as a result of knowing, right? You can't say you don't know the colonial history of BC after sitting through a talk like Larry's this morning. You can't say you don't know, right? So what are your obligations now that you know? And what are the histories that you are contending with in your context, right? What kinds of relations do you and your institution have with the places and people and relations that you are proposing to experiment with or on, right? And this last question, who's at the decision-making table and whose voice matters? My podcast, I'm on this Media Indigenous podcast hosted by Rick Harp, which I mentioned earlier, but Kim Tallbear and I are often paired as regular contributors to it. And I like to use a quote from her work when I talk about whose voice matters, because she's done a lot of research on genetic science when it comes to Indigenous people. And as she has pointed out, when we have more at stake as Indigenous people, then our voice actually needs to matter more. It needs to be heard louder. And I think this is the final thing, I guess, that I would say is that if you take into account Indigenous people as part of the publics that you serve as an institution, do the plans that are intended to help address climate change take into account Indigenous knowers and their knowledge, uneven power relations and access to decision-making, histories of colonialism and still present exclusions, structures and institutions, histories of science that tell us exactly how embroiled science has been in empire, and STS, which is my discipline, science and technology studies, research that tells us science is still central to nation building. So I guess I'll just leave you with the final thought, which is that how we get to understanding crisis, right? That is substantive to considering what we do in response to it. And I agree that we are in a moment of crisis and we are even in a moment of emergency, but it is not unexpected. It is a continuation of many of the challenges that have been ongoing, and Indigenous people have been saying that, right? So how we begin to narrate what's possible, what's useful, right? We have to be mindful of even how we deem what is useful, right? And for whom, to whom, how we begin to think through the ethics. And scholars in my discipline think a lot about ethics when it comes to data. And so just leave you with think about all of the data that you might have on your computer. The ethics are in every cell, right? They're thinking about how you use terms, what the histories are of what you're doing, and hopefully, go forward navigate that space between the good and the bad, keeping in mind that ethics is always going to be a challenge in a colonial context. Again.